I'd like to welcome you to Improving Modern Language. So I'll go through and thank our sponsors, the Blackboard Collaborate and the Learning Revolution, for all the things that we if you can click over on the side and on the star and move it over to where you're from, it would help. Just generally, if you can locate or any of the symbols. Okay, we've just started, so what we're going to do is we've been placing our marker of where we are, and people can do that if you're able to. It sort of helps me get a feeling for it. Okay, wow. Okay, we've got a few more people joining. That's wonderful. Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to begin the presentation on improving modern language speaking proficiency. And what I'd like you to do, if you would please, is if you just do your first name, what city and country you're from, and what you do. You may be a Spanish teacher, you may be a trainer, in the chat box. I would appreciate it, so I'll give you a little bit of time to do that, please. Okay. So, I'll continue with the next one. We know that ACTFL has the 5 C's of communication, communities, comparisons, connections, and cultures. And yet, realistically, we also know that many parents, when they come in to ask us about how their child is doing in modern languages, does not ask about communities. They ask, can my student speak the language? And that's really the thing. We want our students, in fact, to be speakers of the language. It's interesting that we use the term speakers to indicate when someone has a high proficiency in the language. We don't call them a listener of the language. We don't call them a reader of the language. We don't call them a writer of the language. What we do, in fact, call them is a speaker of the language. And so it's interesting that speaking really sums up how the skill that we want people to have. And the UK has done a lot of investigation into speaking in the classroom, and they discovered 3 things. Number 1, that it is the least taught in the classroom. It is, number 2, the least tested in the classroom. And number 3, it is the one in which the teacher spends the least amount of time on in the classroom, on actually teaching students how to speak, how to have a conversation. So, do you generally feel that those statements are true? You can just do a yes or no if you agree. Okay. One of the things that the research that we've noticed in the classroom is that our students get stuck in their speaking. And once they get stuck, they need to have help getting out. They don't naturally just get out of having a speaking problem. And this illustrates to me what our students do in the classroom. They just don't know how to progress in their speaking. And we really have to be able to help them to do that. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ACTFL 90%, which says that the modern language teacher should be speaking in the modern language 90% of the classroom. I think, however, ACTFL missed the point. It's not 90% that's important. It's important how much the students talk in the classroom. I really wish they had tried to say how much speaking they want students to do in the classroom. Because right now, if a student says one sentence correctly, only says one sentence the whole class, and it's in the modern language, they have met the 90% requirement. And I don't think that's what ACTFL really intended. I think they intended for students to be speaking in the language. The first several slides are really background information, and we'll get into more participatory things. The ACTFL Proficiency Guidelines back in 2012 obviously went up the levels. And if we look for a second at the bottom one, which is novice level, we know that students use isolated words and phrases. And they're on highly predictable, memorized topics. And we want our students to climb up in these proficiencies. And luckily, very recently, ACTFL has come out with the NCSSFL/ACTFL can-do statements. And the can-do statements, you can actually just search ACTFL can-do and find them. It's quicker than the long web address. And they have gone through and actually identified statements for interpersonal, presentational speaking, writing, reading, and listening, and very solid statements about each one at each level. And I'm going to give you one example of one. This is novice high for speaking. I can handle short social interactions in everyday situations by asking and answering simple questions. And notice within this, a student can ask and say a home address and email. They can ask and say nationality, talk about family members and their characteristics, talk about friends. So notice these statements are really great in that they're very specific, and students can actually look at these and check off whether they do them or not. In fact, my students in class do. We periodically go through and say, which of these have you achieved and how can we help you to get better at these? So we're going to be sort of blending those in with the rest of the presentation today. In the classroom, I think there are basically two types of speaking that take place. One is very mechanical. It's like the old robots that used to sort of talk like this, and sometimes they wouldn't even say whole sentences. And on the other hand, we have spontaneous speaking. If you notice this person on the surfboard, he is in fact watching everything. He's changing every single second what's happening, where the mechanical one really couldn't. And so we have this difference in our classroom of how students are speaking. And I'd like you to think about the speaking that your students tend to do in the classroom, and which of the two do they seem to do more of. And I'll let you just think that one out to yourself if you want to, unless you're willing to share. My granddaughter, as a baby, couldn't talk very much. She talked in gibberish. She maybe said a sound, a word, but it really didn't make much sense. And what we really want to do is move students from that type of talk past individual words, and we want to get them to a stage of speaking where they can, in fact, jam in the language. And this illustrates to me how people get together, someone starts a conversation, other people join in, and then someone takes the conversation to another topic, someone else, and then people join in that topic, they talk about it, and they keep on changing. And so that's really what we want language to be. And the question is, how do we change it then from a very mechanical, in the classroom, memorized phrases to where we'd like them to be? And the ACTFL standards really do a very interesting thing of looking actually how students progress in their talking. At novice low, they're supposed to just use single words or phrases. Novice mid, they get up to variety. Novice high is a very short interaction. And in intermediate low, they finally have a conversation. And it's a short one. In intermediate mid, they have a conversation with a series of sentences. And intermediate high, they're very at ease in conversation. They can speak, and they can do it in various time frames. So I think it's interesting just to sort of see where APCO wants us to have our students and how we can keep on increasing their level of speaking. And I'd like to show you this definition of fluency. This is actually one of my students' definitions. So notice, being able to hold an in-depth conversation with someone by exchanging thoughts and ideas, asking questions, and solving problems. You respond quickly to questions. And I'd sort of like you to think about, is that the level of fluency that your students are at? I'm going to go to the next statement, and then I'm going to make a quick statement. That there are many measures of oral proficiency, and I'm going to use the word fluency in that sense of being proficient in the language orally. And Skuhan has in fact made a quick measure, which is the number of sentences over the number of minutes that it takes to say those sentences. And I like this definition because it's very workable in the classroom. We can measure students' fluency in this way, and in fact, other students can measure other students' fluency in this way. And so I'm going to give you some examples of this and talk about how I get my students to develop this. So one thing that happens is that students talk like this. And that is certainly not fluency. Okay, when students have to stop and think about every word, they are not fluent. They really can't have a conversation. We want them to speed up. And every time in class that my students speak, and I'll talk a little more about what I mean speak in a second, that I always record the information. So whenever they're having a conversation, they're doing a narration, their description, that information is recorded, and then I can look at it over time and see if they can progress. And I'm actually going to show you how that happens. I'd like to talk to you about, this is basically a form of formative assessment, because it takes the students from where they are right now to where we want them to be. If we show them the actual proficiencies and say, this is where we want you to be, and we provide activities to help them get there, then in fact, we can measure that along the way. Before, we sort of briefly mentioned this, and that is, the more the teacher talks in the classroom, the less the students get to talk. So if we want our students to talk more, teachers in fact have to talk less in the classroom. And it's a very interesting thing that sometimes we think that the more we talk, then the better they're going to be able to do something. But unless they get to practice, we're not going to know that. And I want to give you some examples of this. That one of the things, for example, let's say that you as a teacher want to listen to a student for a minute and give them half a minute of feedback. And you've got 26 students. It's going to take you 39 minutes, which is a whole class period. We don't have time to do that. If we did that and we really wanted our students to talk every single day and do that, that's too much time. So what I'm suggesting is a variation on that. And what I'm suggesting is that students work in pairs, and that one student talks for a minute, then gets feedback from the partner, then the other partner speaks, gets feedback from the partner. So for those same 26 students, they can each speak for a minute and each get feedback for half a minute within 3 minutes of class. If you think of that, everybody has 3 minutes in the class that they can devote to student speaking and getting feedback. And in fact, what it does is it magnifies the amount of speaking that happens in the classroom, and it allows students to get more practice. Swain has said some statement which I think is a very intriguing one. Students learn to speak by speaking. And it's such a simple statement, and yet it's so powerful. And that when students get to speak more, they do it. And I think one of the things I want to talk when I talk about speaking, I am not referring to do grammar exercises like, did you buy the pencil? Yes, I bought the pencil. Did you walk to the store? Yes, I walked to the store. That's grammar activities. And it's not vocabulary activities, such as somebody asking a question, do you have a refrigerator in your kitchen? I've actually seen that question in textbooks. No, that's not speaking. That's vocabulary drill. And it's not pronunciation drills. Okay? One of the things that I found out that has been critical to me is that we really want students to be talking. We want them to have conversations. And I've traveled to Spanish-speaking countries over 22 times, and I know I make lots of mistakes when I speak. But the most interesting thing is the natives don't correct me. They simply ask me a question for clarification. And if they're doing that in their country, then in the classroom, shouldn't we do the same thing with students? Let them communicate as many ideas as they can and help them to clarify those ideas later on, but focusing always on their communicating ideas. And so today we're going to basically, and I'd like you to think about that for a second in your own classroom. You know, do you focus more on teaching grammar, the preciseness of the language, or do you focus more on having students communicate ideas? And a quick test of that is, what do you spend more time in? And if you think of the amount of time you spend every period, do you spend more time in teaching them grammar or more time in helping them to communicate? I'd love you to think about your final for a second. And if you can just jot down in the chat room what percentage on your final is speaking. And if you do it in terms of 10, 20, 30, whatever. So what percentage of your final is speaking? People are putting in their answers, and I have to share with you, it intrigues me that in real life, listening and speaking account for 70% of our over 70% of our communication. And yet, in a language classroom, it's reduced down to a very small percentage. I always find it intriguing that somehow we don't follow how things are like in real life. So, I'd like to share with you that many teachers in New York State, anyway, have 20% of their final being speaking. And I'd like us to think about that for a second. If 20% of your final is speaking, and you have 40 minutes every class, then if you're doing understanding by design or backward design, then that really means that 8 minutes of every class should be student speaking. And I think if we think of it in that way, that's a very different way of thinking about it, if that's really what we want to achieve. We want our students to be able to communicate. We want them to be able to talk. And not only do we want them to talk, but we want them to increase over time. And so today we're going to go over some things to do that with. And I'm going to deal with giving structure, using questions as a way of increasing their fluency. And so I'm going to deal with two major things today. One is answering questions and using different verbs as a way of increasing their fluency. So at interpersonal level, they can answer some basic questions. They can respond to who, what, where, why, when questions. And so what I'm going to suggest is a form that I'm sharing with you right now up on the screen. And every student in my class has this form, and every day when we speak, they record, or their partner records the information on this sheet. And so we can check their progress. And the students will always see if they can say more during this. And so I'm going to refer to the sheet as I'm talking about the following activities. One of the first activities I start with in basic Spanish class, in my case, and these questions are in the target language. I did them in English so everybody could, in fact, understand them. That they have basic questions about a picture, and they answer those questions orally. So they just see these questions. And if you notice, there's a where question, a how many question, a when question, a what question, how old. These are basic questions. And so students see if they can answer these questions orally and how quickly they can answer these questions about a given picture. So the students would, in fact, my students actually, what you're seeing on the screen now, my students would see, except that it would be in Spanish for them. And so they do it, and these are basic questions they've gone over and over again. And so obviously one student talks, the other student's recording the sentences. And in my classroom, the sentences have to be comprehensible, meaningful, and appropriate. So for example, if the question is how many people are there, they can't say the man is tall. Okay, they have to be able to do that. So they are answering these questions, and it gets recorded on the sheet. So the partner is recording it, and then what happens is after the partner records it, the partner goes over anything that the person missed or didn't get right. For example, if the person didn't answer how many correctly, the partner helps them. And students are very good at helping them that. Okay. And so basically then I have comments like this, is my partner waits until I'm finished to help me with the question words, helps me report sentences from the questions, and tells me my word errors. And so these are students that are randomly paired. They choose their own partner, and every day they have a different partner who helps them to do this. And so the goal is always that they get feedback about how to answer questions better, and they get more feedback and more feedback until they can be successful. And the students not only do that, but they increase in the number of questions that they can ask in that amount of time. So before there were only 10, now they're up to 15, 16 questions that they're expected to answer in the same amount of time. So students are increasing the number of sentences they can say in the same amount of time. And again, all of these questions are basic questions that we would have, basic question words that we would have done in class. And from day to day, the questions vary slightly, but it's getting them so ingrained in knowing how to answer questions that they can do these questions spontaneously. They never prepare, they just simply see these and begin answering them. And so this statement from a student, as time went on, I was able to answer more questions because my vocabulary expanded. The list of questions got longer, and I improved my speaking speed. And I'm going to actually show you from one student, and I chose a student because he was my lowest student in terms of initial speaking. He started out by saying, being able to answer 4 questions in 2 minutes. And by the 6th try, he could actually answer 8 questions in that. So notice, he doubled the amount that he could say in the same time period. And generally that was true. 80% of my class doubled the amount that they could say in 2 minutes. 10% that only increased 100%, they were already pretty high to start with. And I did have 10% that actually increased 300%. And they get doing this. So notice, we measure every single day that a student speaks. The partner records that sentence, the sentences that they said. They give them feedback. They tell them how they can get better. And we keep on practicing these basic sentences so they get very good at answering them. And by the way, I'm sure you're all aware that if students can answer questions well orally, then they can also do well when they do reading exercises, and when they do writing, they sort of think of the answers to the basic questions and they're able to do those. So my students then progress. The next phase we do is not answering questions, but then making up questions about a picture. And again, we do the same chart. The partners listen to make sure that they can ask questions that make sense, and they're recorded. The partner keeps on giving them feedback all the time as to what's happening. Basically, what happens then is these activities keep on moving students from the novice low level of answering questions to now being able to create questions. And I'm very aware of what level my students are at when they're speaking and how we can constantly move them up. And because they do these charts, I can check their charts and find out where the class is and figure out how to move them ahead. And research has shown that when students do the same similar activity several times, that they actually improve drastically and be able to do it. So we do this. So again, students do this, and now they've moved on from answering questions to being able to ask them, which is moving up to the novice mid-level. And we have to purposely give them activities that lead them up to it. And again, they always record this on the sheet, and to do that with. Yeah, the nice thing about this is that do I grade them on their increase? What I do is I actually have a master number that I'm telling them that I want them to do, and I'm amazed the number of students that reach that number. And so I have both. So I have the grade that I actually want them to do, but then the increase. And I think it's very interesting to see the number that do. And if I give them that, we have enough practice, all my students can reach the level, which is at least 10. They should be able to do 10, answer 10 per time period. Okay. So what I want to move up to then is another activity, and that is something I'm sure we're all familiar with, and that is that we're going to be trying to get rid of the word is. My students generally have an is disease, and that means they use is in every sentence, and that means their sentences really aren't very powerful. So we're going to talk about how to give them variety. And so again, students are going to speak, and this time I tell them the secret is that they have to use a different verb every time, or more often. And so here's an example of someone speaking. John is tall. He is thin. He is smart. Notice on here they have a plus, and the plus indicates that, in fact, the student has said an original sentence. He is thin is the same sentence as the previous one. All they've really done is change the pronoun to the noun to the pronoun and done another adjective. And the same thing with he is smart. So these sentences just get a mark that simply says it's the same sentence. They didn't change anything. But he speaks French, they get a +4 because it's a new verb. And he writes a composition, they get credit for it because he says a new one. So their goal is to see how many different sentences they can say about something. And one of the things that I do is I give them a huge list of Spanish verbs. And I say, I want you to learn 6 of these verbs really well. You have to know their meaning really well and how it relates to your family. And use those, and those 6 verbs that you can talk about your family without even hesitating. And as students think about that, they're not overwhelmed by this huge list that quite often we give students. And I just say, pick any 6, and then use those to describe yourself, you, or your family, and make sure only to pick on verbs that you know are going to help them. And so generally then, I have something like this happening, and we record it, the number of sentences, the number of variations. And you can see here in the very beginning, students start out very low, like they said, the students start with 2 sentences, 1 variation, 4, 1 variation. But notice over here, they begin to say more sentences and more variations. And they get to 7 to 3, 8 to 5. The more variations they say, the more they're actually communicating, the more different information they're giving, and the more that they are actually telling us various things. And I'd like you to just think about that for a second. And I'm going to show you a picture, and I'd like you to sort of, for yourself, just say sentences and see how many different sentences you can say about this picture that are different. And I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay. And so normally, you would be saying these out loud, your partner would be listening for different verbs and keeping track of what you've said and then help you if you've done something. And it's really interesting as students begin thinking about using different verbs, they can begin to communicate a lot more information. So these two techniques, the one of answering questions orally in a certain amount of time and doing repeated ones of those, and of practicing saying different verbs, help students to really increase in the amount that they can say. And so basically what I do in my class is when students have officially completed a actual level, I give them a certificate. And it looks something like this. And so this one my students received when they showed that they could answer all the question words that ACTL had at novice low. And students are very proud of these certificates. And for many students, they're telling me it's the first time they've ever had any proof of how well they can speak in a language classroom. Because usually students, other than a test, they don't have any sense of how well they're doing in speaking in the classroom. And this certificate actually shows them how well they're doing. And I now teach at the college after having taught 6th grade up through all of high school. And my students get to a stage where in 3 minutes they're going to see a picture they've never seen before. And with no preparation, they're going to talk about it. And those students can generally ask, answer 10.5 sentences, and they can use 7.5 different verbs. Now, if they're saying 7.5 different verbs off the top of their head with no preparation, you can tell that they have developed, they become proficient in the language, that they really can talk, they can ask and answer questions, they can carry on a full conversation. And so our students can do this if we, in fact, structure the activities up to this point. And a quick comment I want to make about my pictures is that the only pictures I ever use in classroom are pictures that the students bring in on their mobile device or pictures from the Hispanic culture. And so every time they're actually talking about a cultural image and talking about that. But notice by this way, I actually have this goal for students, and I tell them that this is generally what I expect, that all students should be able to say 10 sentences, and they should be able to have at least 7 verbs in that. And since they don't know what the picture is going to be, they really have to be able to do it off the top of their head. I'm going to go over some quick PR stuff, and then I'll come back and I'll let you ask some questions. I do have a book that will be out in a matter of a few days on modern language proficiencies, can-do strategies, that is primarily is going to be on speaking. And it's going to be an ebook, so it's going to be out very quickly. I'm just waiting for the final things on that. I do also have some of the materials available online to help teachers with activities that are spontaneous speaking that lead up to the proficiencies. And people seem to like these activities. In fact, many have actually said that their principal actually said they were good activities and students like it. I do have a book on mobile learning that has some cultural activities and lots of speaking activities using the mobile device. And I have a book that actually deals with improving foreign language speaking through formative assessment. That does that. And so there's my general blurb information. Questions, please. Okay, one of the questions is that school second semester or 101 is the start of completing, it's a college course, it's the first semester of a college course. However, when I taught 6th grade, my speaking final was for students to say 10 sentences about a topic that they were familiar with. And I thought that was important for beginning students to be able to do that, and my students could do that. They could also carry on 4 to 5 question conversations with each other about topics. And I think if we really believe in speaking, then we change our classroom into an atmosphere where students, in fact, practice speaking spontaneously, and that they can actually then hold conversations with people. Other questions, please. Do I use games with my students? No. Well, the only game we do are speaking activities. I do lots of speaking activities that are in fact games, but the game is who can say the most sentences about something. That's the type of games that I do. Grading, yes, if I could change my grading, I would go to a complete proficiency grading system for students to show how they have moved up in the proficiencies. And I think that that's the best way for us to ever to assess students, is to say, how have they moved up through the various can-do statements. And truthfully, it's much more meaningful to their parents to be able to see those statements than it is to see a B. You know, that doesn't mean anything. And how have I incorporated mobile learning? Oh, so many ways. 90 ways, in fact, no, more than that. For example, the other day, my students actually, I said, we were doing a family unit, so I said, okay, pull out your mobile devices, and would you please find a picture of your family, or a person in your family. And then in groups of 2, one person held up their mobile device to the person, and the person looking at the picture asked questions about the person in the picture. What's the person's name? How old is the person? And they had to ask at least 8 different questions about the person in the picture. And the person who had the phone answered those questions. Any other questions, please? I want to talk just 1 second about mobile, and that is, I believe any activity I do in class using technology should be something that they can instantly start to talk or write or whatever the proficiency is we're working on, and that the technology should never take very long to do it all. In fact, I have what I call a 90-10 rule, that 90% of the time has to be students speaking the language or demonstrating the language, and only 10% of the time can be them getting out the technology, doing things in the technology. I always want to remain focused on what we really are in class for, and that is to get students to speak. Other questions, please? Yes, if I had my druthers, I would completely change the whole way that speaking is done, and make speaking and listening to be, as I said before, 70 to 80% of it, because that's really what we do in life. that think of how little we really write in life, and yet on most exams that's at least 25% of the test, and I don't know why. If we speak more than we write, then why do we make writing as important as speaking? And so I would definitely have a final like that. And I think if you talk about in many schools, defense schools, you know, their grade is really predominantly their speaking. Speaking and listening are 70% of our daily communication. You know. A quick comment about speaking on the final. We always assume students have to speak to us on the final, and yet research has shown that in fact students speak better when they speak in pairs, and it's more of a natural act. They actually get higher scores when they do it that way. And so it's interesting that when most of my testing I do is in pairs. Students have a conversation that on a topic they don't know about previously, or a picture, and they begin that conversation. What type of listening skills do I test on? I try to make them as proficiency based as possible. For example, I can't think one off the top of my head. We just did a whole thing on family, and so we asked numerous questions about I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on that. Do I record it? No, I actually use the same sheet. I actually grade the students as they're speaking in pairs. Just as students were recording each other as they were speaking during class, I use the same form basically. And again, if it's comprehensible, if it's meaningful and appropriate, then they get full points for it. I don't take off for minor things unless I can't understand the sentence, and if I can't understand the sentence, I don't count the sentence. And I want to talk about the other type of final that some of you may be familiar with. I know in some schools, students get a list of topics, and then they can prepare these topics ahead of time, and then when they come in, the teacher chooses one of them, and then the students repeat, you know, basically recite what they've memorized. To me, that's not a speaking final. If students have an opportunity to memorize what they're going to say, then that's not a speaking final anymore. I've used lots of tools that they can record their voices on. Truthfully, right now, we do most of the stuff on their smartphone because you can record on their smartphone. So we just keep it simple and do it that way. Other questions, please. Okay, what I would do is, well, anybody think of my last question, is I would like to encourage you to have your students speak more in the class and to have them, as they're speaking, go up the levels of proficiency that are listed in the actual can-do statements and carefully structure your class so that they learn the things that help them to move up. And sadly, some of those things may not be in the textbook, or you may have to rearrange parts of the textbook so that they can do those things. And then your students will really, when they get speaking in the classroom, they get so excited about it. Talk about motivation. They are so excited when they can see themselves speaking in the classroom and communicating, and the partner responds to them. So I hope all of you will be able to do this. What kind of things do I expect students to memorize? Yeah. My students initially memorize vocabulary so that they can use it, but I don't ever have any speaking tests where students memorize anything. In fact, no time in my classroom when students are speaking do they have any time to prepare. I think one of the problems with memorizing vocabulary is unless you move vocabulary to actual sentences where they communicate words, ideas, then no one remembers them. The other day, for example, I was teaching some vocabulary for food, and about every 4 or 5 words, I broke it up and asked them a question that they had to ask their partner. For example, how is this food? Or do you like this food? Or do you eat this often? And so we kept on breaking up the vocabulary, and they would keep on asking. And I teach them a few words, they'd learn them, and they'd use them in a mini little conversation. We'd go back and learn some more words. And every time they were learning more sentences that they could communicate in. Okay, you're welcome. And like I said, if you're interested, you can either rewatch this or lots of materials out that I've shared with you. I'm really proud of the book that's just been finished on modern language proficiency can-do statements, in that I've really tried to have a lot of practical suggestions for how to do things in that. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll allow a couple more minutes for questions, and otherwise we'll close out. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming through, so I am now going to stop the recording. Thank you all much. Please make sure to log out on the upper right-hand corner of your screen where the X is. Okay, you're welcome. Hope you use the techniques and let me know if they worked well for you. Okay, I'll wait for you people to close to leave. Okay.